All right, you've seen me up here before. Again, I'm Hilmar Lapp. I'm meanwhile at Duke University. This is work that's partly also been incubated at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center in both are in Durham, North Carolina. As I think you're broadly aware in this room, there is a raging reproducibility crisis in science, or at least it's been labeled that way, and it's been found important and pervasive enough to make it into the top scientific journals with special issues. It has wide-ranging impacts, including not only for the academic sector, but also for the private sector that's trying to take advantage of research results and translate them into practical applications. So, as I said, it's reproducibility does truly matter, not only for science as an enterprise, and not only for other research in the community, but actually also, for example, for public policy, as we can just see in this paper that's been retracted recently, because the data were essentially never shared to start with, hampering reproducibility from the outset, and then it turned out that the data were probably faked. Reproducibility also matters actually for patients. So reproducibility can affect lives. So here's an example for a study that influenced treatment for a preterm newborns. And finally, where perhaps I'm going to try to focus on and what I'm going to try to emphasize here for the rest of the talk, it matters really for oneself as a researcher. And what this really boils down to is that reproducibility is all about accelerating science, because lack of reproducibility impedes science. So, the converse actually does hold. Reproducible science is science that can be easier and faster built upon and reused and extended. And so, as been pointed out, any work that you do to make your analysis, your research, your computational science more reproducible pays dividends, not only for your colleagues, but in fact for yourself, specifically for your future self. This is particularly, so reproducible research doing research reproducibly is actually quite challenging in general, and it's particularly challenging for computational research. And so here's just sort of the highlights of an exercise the informatics team at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center did about 1.5 years ago, where we picked 3 studies from authors that were particularly attuned to making their research, their computational research, reproducible, and where they paid particular attention to making the results reproducible. And yet, it led to all kinds of challenges trying to reproduce their work. Reproducing reproducible science is in itself very eye-opening and revealing. And so for computational science, most software has many dependencies is one big issue. And so if anything in that dependency chain fails to install, you're stumped there. Often documentation, as we're well aware, has all kinds of gaps, sometimes lagging behind, has errors. These may be harmless for the people who are very familiar with it, but actually can be fatal for others. If you have a workflow that reproduces right now, runs from start to finish, that doesn't mean it also will run in a year from now, because dependencies may expect different parameters and so on and so forth. So furthermore, for computational research specifically, there's bewildering technology soup, going from version control, provenance, ontologies, checksums, containerization, continuous integration, literate programming, knitr, and various data archives. And importantly, all the technology soup, by definition is about technology, is not really about science. So, should every scientist really have to be truly and fully aware of every element of the technology soup? And arguably not, right? So that's where the reproducible science curriculum and the workshop in Hackathon that gave rise to it come in. is to develop, its purpose was to develop an open source curriculum for a 2-day workshop modeled sort of after the very successful software carpentry model on reproducibility for computational research. And so this was held at the workshop and hackathon that produced the curriculum in its first iteration, was held December 11th to 14th in 2014 at Nescent in Durham. It has 2 parts. The first part was brainstorming and then conference style, and then followed by 2 days of actual curriculum, taking the ideas that were surfaced during the brainstorming. The event, the participants were covered actually pretty amazing diversity, both in terms of field they were coming from, in terms of career track, in terms of seniority, and in terms of expertise. And so the goals of this, of the workshop, the goals for the curriculum to be produced was really to make it modular so that it can be disseminated in different formats, that it can be contributed to in different formats. There were to be no restrictions on or barriers to reuse. So all the material is in fact under a CC0 public domain waiver, and there was to be the workshop was really meant to develop a curriculum that doesn't develop new or a hackathon that doesn't develop new tools, but develops curriculum that takes advantage of what exists already, which is a fair bit. So key concepts that the curriculum tries to teach and bring across is first, as I mentioned before, the benefits. The way to think about reproducibility is not something you do at the very end of your research for others, at which point it's very hard, but it's something that the earlier you do it, the earlier you start it in a research project, the more benefits it accrues to yourself, right? And that applies whether you're like a graduate student or a postdoc, or whether you're the PI of a lab, right? Because if your lab does research reproducibly, people joining your lab are more likely to pick up work from others in the lab and do so faster. So again, the idea of reproducible research is accelerated scientific progress. The second principle is that reproducible research is not a point, it's a spectrum, right? And so at one end of the spectrum, you have research that's completely unreproducible, and there is also research that's end-to-end reproducible with a pipeline that starts from the very beginning, downloading data, and then crunches away, and then finally ends with the figures produced. But there's a lot of room in the beginning, right? And the idea is that any step you take above and any step you take to improve towards that other end has benefits, right, and helps. The third concept is literate programming. The idea that that one of the problems in, especially if you conduct your research yourself, is analysis results that are completely disconnected from the question, the context, the code that generated it, and so on and so forth. Think of figures pasted into manuscript documents, right? Where did the figure come from? What's the code that produced it? From which day? Which version, right? What was the data that was used, It's very, very difficult to discern from a figure pasted into a document. Whereas with literate programming, you have it all right there, right? The code's there. You can precede the code with text that gives it narration and context. And then what results from the code itself shows which data were taken in, and then the results show right up there. Another principle is to use one data set throughout the whole workshop. We use the Gapminder data set. It's a fairly well-known data set that can be used to teach the right principles. Maybe not any specific to any one particular domain, but that's kind of also the point, right? It's not a genomic data set, it's not an ecology data set, but it's a data set that still allows us to carry the principles. And so also, and the final one is the curriculum really pursues a two-pronged approach. One, it's trying to raise scientists with workflow from the start, who just start getting into these computational research workflows, right? To raise them with workflows that are reproducible, so they don't know anything else, right? They don't know how to do it irreproducibly, right? But it also tries to show people who've been doing this for a while in ways that maybe are not so reproducible, which practices and tools they could adopt to make it more reproducible. So the inaugural workshop was taught in May, just 2 months ago at Duke, and here's the syllabus of that first workshop. It essentially, so the first day in the morning, we start with an introduction, motivating reproducible research. Why does it actually matter? What are the problems that can raise with it? How do you actually realize that what you do may not be very reproducible, right? Kind of teaching that. And then goes into our studio, teaching our Markdown for Literate Programming, which is then further emphasized in the afternoon. There's quite a bit of teaching using organizational principles to, wrestle the chaos that file management can bring with them, naming conventions, directory conventions, just really best practices, right? On the second day, we teach about R using not just R scripting, but specifically teaching about automation, right? Using functions and using automated testing. In the afternoon, then, we teach about sharing and publishing, both for data and code, archiving as a separate subject, actually, licensing issues. And so then, I'll get to that in a moment, what turned out in the first syllabus is that what was missing from that and what the then taught at the very end is version control in GitHub. So the second workshop was held about a month ago at the University of Florida at a biodiversity collections center. And so what we applied a few tweaks you applied. We went into literate programming a little earlier because it turned out that people don't need that much convincing, really, that these practices is what they need to adopt. And we also integrated version control into the curriculum really from the outset. So some observations that first off, there was the demand for the course was really unexpected. We really expected we'd have to do a lot of convincing, outreach, that this is actually something people should spend their time on, and take out 2 days out of their busy research lives. It turned out the first workshop sold out in a day, in less than 24 hours. And we have a long waiting list. So there's a lot of awareness and demand, really. The second observations is what people do right now, the practices they employ cover a wide range, from things that are actually pretty good and kind of tune in and tie into the principles we teach, to something that scratch paper, and Word for documenting your research, right? And then, also I spoke with it a little earlier. Don't be afraid about version control. Version control is sort of is something that's taught in software carpentry, for example. It takes up a whole morning, right? We don't really have time here, so that's why we decided to not teach it in the first workshop. And then it turned out to be the most frequently and consistently requested subject that the students wanted to hear more about, right? So now we're trying to kind of squeeze it into the curriculum, but in a sort of simplified form. And so finally, we also, we chose R for this first version of the curriculum deliberately. It's very popular in data analysis, right? It cuts across many domains. It's free, it's open source, supported on the 3 major platforms. And, it's actually really well suited to teaching the key concepts I was talking about earlier. But there are other programming languages quite popular as well in scientific programming, such as Python. And we do get people who struggle then with the peculiar syntax of R. So you know, one thing that, for example, would be really good to have this implemented in iPython. Our future plans, just one more minute. Future plans is really, we're at the stage now where we have a good amount of feedback as to what needs to be tweaked. So one of the next steps really is a material development workshop. And another big thing is, you know, how do we sustain and grow the effort? Funding ends in 2015, so one idea is to have this adopted under the data carpentry umbrella. Okay, that brings me to my end. First, I wanted to thank everyone here who's involved with this, people on the organizing committee, people who have helped teach the workshop, people who have given inspiration, and funding agency. And finally, just wanted to make a brief call out here. You know, we do try to eat our own dog food here, you know, in terms of, you know, using text formats that are version controllable, that are easier to share, and so on and so forth, right? So the whole presentation on GitHub in a text-based format, and the HTML version is generated from that. Thank you.